Hi, my name's David Hill, and I'm a Senior Technical Marketing Architect working for VMware's Cloud Services Business Unit, vCloud Air. In this tutorial, we're going to talk about VMware vCloud Air Disaster Recovery offering and the advanced concepts around that. We'll look at how you can implement pilot-like virtual machines around Active Directory infrastructure and how we can build those out leveraging new features like cross-connect and our new virtual private cloud on-demand service. So in this slide, you can see that we have our on-premises data center and we're replicating virtual machines out to vCloud Air Disaster Recovery. But what do we do about things like Active Directory? We need to perform local authentication lookups in the event that our data center fails. So the first thing we can do is leverage something called cross-connect. This is where you actually rent a cage in one of our data centers and you can bring your own physical servers into that cage. And then we can connect those servers to vCloud Air using Direct Connect, which is a 1 GB link between the cage and the vCloud Air environment. So when you fail over to vCloud Air, you can actually fail over those virtual machines, power them on, and then all the local authentication happens with the Active Directory servers running in that cage. Another option is to leverage the virtual private cloud on demand. Now, this follows a very similar pattern to what you just saw with cross-connect. However, in this instance, you're actually spinning up virtual machines in the cloud to provide you the infrastructure services that you need. So in this diagram, you can see we have our on-premises data center on our left. We have a domain network where our Active Directory and DNS run, and then we have our virtual machines running on a corporate network. We replicate those corporate network virtual machines out to vCloud Air Disaster Recovery, so they're available to us in the event of a disaster and a failover. And then we spin up a virtual private cloud on demand VPC. This allows us to then build an Active Directory and DNS server out in the cloud. And we simply connect these together using IPsec VPNs. We can then configure Active Directory as a second site and replicate all the information we need for authentication between the two sites. Then in the event of a failure, all the virtual machines that we've been replicating to vCloud Air Disaster Recovery just perform authentication over the IPsec VPN to the virtual machines that are running in the on-demand VPC. We can even go further and use a direct connect connection between our on-premises data center and the vCloud Air Disaster Recovery virtual private cloud, and we can leverage that to speed up our replication. So you could buy a 1 gig link between on-premises and vCloud Air Disaster Recovery and do your replication over that, and then implement the VPN so we can perform our infrastructure authentication locally. So now we're going to take a look at a video that shows us how we actually implement these advanced concepts. We'll take a look at how we authenticate locally when we're running on premises, and how we then, when we fail over to the vCloud Air Disaster Recovery virtual private cloud, how we do authentication with virtual machines running in a virtual private cloud. So in this video, we're going to look at how we replicate domain member servers and how we actually do authentication with Active Directory. As we were talking about in the slides, we have VPNs in place between our disaster recovery virtual data center, an on-demand virtual private cloud, and our on-premises environment. So we're going to take a look at a few things here. Let's start by checking the status of our domain member server that we're actually replicating to vCloud Air Disaster Recovery. Now, this virtual machine is being replicated to the DR environment, and in the event of a failure, we want to be able to actually authenticate against local Active Directory servers that are running in the cloud. So we can see here that we have a virtual machine VMTM domain test. Its current replication status is OK, and we can see our sync sizes and RPOs. So what we want to do is first we actually want to look at the configuration settings of this virtual machine and how it is actually connected to our environment. So we're going to open a console and we will log in to this virtual machine. Now, a few of the things that we want to check is we want to look at what domain controller we're actually authenticating against and what the IP address is of this virtual machine. So let's quickly check what domain server we authenticate against. And we can see that we've authenticated against the domain controller AD01. And if we quickly look at our IP address settings, we can see that this virtual machine is on the 192.168.1 subnet, and that we can ping our domain controller AD01. So that's very important when you think about what's actually happening with this virtual machine. So this VM is running in our on-premises environment in our vSphere clusters, and it's authenticating against an Active Directory domain controller called AD01 in the same on-premises environment. So it's doing local authentication, lookups against a server that is local to itself. So as we were talking about, what we also have is some domain controllers running in vCloud Air. And let's take a quick look at these domain controllers and what we have configured. So we're going to log in to our vCloud Air environment. The first thing that we're going to do is take a look at our virtual private cloud on demand. And we have a virtual data center configured in our Virginia region, which is the same region that we have our disaster recovery virtual data center as well. Now, if we look at our VMTN corporate virtual data center, we can see that we have a number of virtual machines running in that virtual data center. And we have some Active Directory servers, AD09, 10, and 11. Now, these virtual machines are actually replicating all their Active Directory information between our on-premises AD servers and our cloud AD servers. And if we look in our gateways for this virtual data center, if you remember in the diagram that we were talking about previously, we had VPNs in place, so we could actually do the replication over these VPNs. And what we have set up here is we have a few networks. So we created a network that's called Authentication Network. And this Authentication Network is the actual network that our Active Directory servers sit on. So we connect these to a VPN configured to route back to our on-premises environment. So we can see that we've got a number of NAT rules and firewall rules, allowing us to connect between our Virginia on-demand environment and our corporate environment back in WDC. So if we now take a look at our disaster recovery virtual data center, you will also see that we have VPNs in place between the disaster recovery VDC and our on-demand VDC. So we're now in our disaster recovery VDC, and we can see the virtual machine that we're going to fail over, the VMTM domain test, and the replication is in progress. So let's take a quick look at our networks for this VDC. And we have our test network and our recovery network that we were talking about in some previous tutorials. And we have authentication network. So let's take a look at the gateways, and we will look at some of the rules. So much in the same way that we configured with our on-demand virtual private cloud, we have very similar firewall rules and NAT rules to allow us to have all these different networks talk to each other over the VPN configuration. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to go into the vSphere replication, and we're going to fail this virtual machine over. So as we saw in the previous tutorials, when we fail this virtual machine over to our disaster recovery VDC, this will actually be running in our cloud environment. It won't be running anymore in our on-premises environment. So we're going to initiate the failover, and we run through the wizard, enter our credentials. We're just going to say synchronize recent changes, and in the interest of time we'll just say power off, so it'll just stop the virtual machine. And we will also say powered on the recovered virtual machine. So we'll click finish, and this will now run through the workflow required to actually fail this virtual machine over to our disaster recovery virtual data center. Let's now switch over to vCloud Air and have a look. And we can see that our workload VMTM domain test has actually failed over, and it's powered on. So we need to do a number of tests to make sure that this virtual machine authenticating against our local domain controller running out in the cloud. So we're going to open the console, and we're going to log in into this virtual machine using our domain credentials. Now what we will find is that the first thing to check is that our IP address has changed. So we can now see that our IP address is 192.168.20.203. So what we've actually done in this scenario is we have DHCP configured on those networks. So when the virtual machine failed over, it automatically assigned a new IP address to this virtual machine. So let's confirm that the logon server has actually changed. So we can see here that we are now authenticating against our domain controller VMTM-AD11, which is the one that we looked at earlier that's running in our virtual private cloud on demand. Now if we do a quick ping of VMTM-AD11, we can see that we're pinging 10.0.10.20, which again is the subnet that's in our local cloud environment. So we can see here that we've tried to ping AD01, and we're unable to because we don't have VPN connectivity from our recovery network through to our on-premises data center. And that's by design. As we noticed in the diagram that we showed on the slides, the VPN connection is from our on-demand virtual private cloud back to our on-premises data center, and then we have a cloud-to-cloud VPN between our disaster recovery virtual data center and our on-demand VPC. So we can see that we failed over, and we can authenticate against that virtual machine that's running in our cloud environment. That concludes this demonstration.
So as you saw in that video, a lot of the advanced concepts were around how we configure Active Directory. Now what we're seeing here is the number of steps that we perform to actually do an end-to-end setup and failback process. So you can see on the left-hand side, we attach our vCloud Air disaster recovery site. We step through configuring our networks, how we configure the outgoing replication, so how we configure the replication from our on-premises vSphere environment out to vCloud Air. We then do the initial sync, we do test failovers and full failovers. So when you look at these steps, these are all based on the tutorials that we've been going through previously. So you can see how you configure those sites and how you perform your full failovers. Then once we failed over to the cloud, the steps on the right-hand side show you how you actually bring that virtual machine back to your on-premises cloud from vCloud Air. So in very much the same way as you configure your replication to the cloud, the steps are very similar to bring it back. So we attach to the recovery site, which is your on-premises environment. You delete the original VM if this is an environment where you've done a planned migration. If you're recovering to a brand new environment due to a data center explosion or any other kind of natural disaster, then that virtual machine wouldn't exist. So you don't really need to perform that step. Then you configure incoming replication, you do your initial syncing, you test the failback, and then you perform a full failback. So we've walked through all the steps here that you actually need to perform to replicate to a cloud and then recover from the cloud in the event of a disaster. We have a number of options as well around automation. As we mentioned in the initial videos, we talk about how you can automate your solutions using a vRealize Orchestrator plugin. We also have other options around vRealize automation. You can leverage plugins with Puppet or Chef or other third-party solutions. And included in the automation options is the ability to manage virtual machine changes. So if you want to configure additional networks, change any IP addresses or anything like that, you can automate all that using plugins and third-party solutions. You can also do things like creating manual runbooks. So in the event of a failover, you have your automated runbook available to you so that you can actually go through the steps to power on your virtual machines and recover to the cloud. We provide you with the ability to have APIs so you can script all this by leveraging the vCloud Air extensions, the Recovery as a Service extensions, and the networking extensions. And then we give you the ability in those APIs to automate failover, testing, failback, create startup orders. So if you have multiple tiers of applications, so you have a 3-tier web application, for example, you can configure the startup order because you would want the SQL database to start before the web server. So you can configure those startup orders and create recovery groups as well. With the vRealize Orchestrator plugin that we've been talking about, you get the ability to create plugins and workflows by clicking through some simple steps. So you can configure replication to the cloud, and from the cloud, you can register your cloud site. And this is all done by just clicking on the workflows and putting in the credentials that are needed. Then you configure with vRealize Orchestrator trigger points that allow you to actually run these workflows in the event of a particular scenario. So when we look at the vRealize Orchestrator solution and how we can automate an end-to-end disaster recovery solution, what we can do is leverage the similar concepts that we spoke about with Active Directory and DNS in a virtual private cloud on demand. So we deploy a vRealize Orchestrator appliance in an on-demand environment, and this monitors our data center for failure. So if our data center was to go down, the vRealize Orchestrator would detect this. So when this data center fails, the vRealize Orchestrator realizes that this site is no longer available. And then we run workflows and scripts that we pre-created to actually power on the virtual machines. So it'll go out and it'll do API calls to vCloud Air, and then it'll convert those virtual machines to failed over virtual machines and power them on. So we've fully automated our disaster recovery solution here by leveraging vRealize Orchestrator plugin. So this allows us to automate that solution, create our startup groups and our recovery options, and build out a fully automated end-to-end solution. That concludes the Advanced Concepts tutorial. To watch these tutorials on VMware's vCloud Air disaster recovery, go to vcloud.vmware.com/tutorials. Thank you for watching.